Its dried lips are bloody. They have sharp, yellowish fangs and long, slimy tongues. According to the stories of the Algonquin people, the Windigo is a malevolent, cannibalistic creature that can possess human bodies. Based on the legends, people who indulge in cannibalism are highly at risk for becoming Wendigos. Wendigos are said to give off a foul odour that resembles a stinking carcass in the advanced stages of decomposition. Based on the tribal stories, the Wendigos have an appetite for human flesh. They never get full. Despite having a fresh flesh feast, they will continuously look for another victim. And another. And another. The beasts are said to lurk in the forests, especially during the winter period or during times of famine. Some sightings of a mysterious shadowy creature have been reported in the forests of the northern regions of Minnesota. Tribes often attribute the loss of their hunters and forest dwellers to the gluttonous characteristic of the Wendigos. One of the more famous cases of the Wendigo psychosis involved a Plains Cree trapper from Alberta named Swift Runner. During the winter of 1878, Swift Runner and his family were starving, and his eldest son died. 25 miles away from the emergency food supplies at a Hudson Bay Company post, Swift Runner butchered and ate his wife and 5 remaining children. Given that he resorted to cannibalism so near to food supplies, and he killed and consumed the remains of all those present, it was revealed that Swift Runner's was not a case of pure cannibalism as a last resort to avoid starvation, but rather of a man from suffering Wendigo psychosis. He eventually confessed and was executed. brother's prone body. The first shot ripped into Ronald Sr.'s back, tearing through his kidney and exiting through his chest. Butch fired another round, again into his back, and this shot pierced his father's spine, lodging in his neck. Louise DeFeo had now awakened, but had no time to react before Butch fired at her too. He shot her twice, shattering her rib cage and collapsing her right lung, and then left her to empty into the spreading pool of blood on the bed. Despite the crack of the rifle shots, no one else in the house stirred. Butch left his parents' room to continue the massacre, making his two young brothers, John and Mark, his next victims. He entered the bedroom the two boys shared and fired one shot into each of them as they lay sleeping. Mark was killed instantly, while John, whose spinal cord was severed by his brother's attack, twitched for a few moments, then lay still. Again, the shots had not roused the remaining members of the family, and Butch went unchallenged into the bedroom that his sisters Dawn and Alison shared. Dawn was the closest in age to Butch, while Alison was in grade school with John and Mark. As Butch walked into the room, Alison stirred and looked up just as he pointed the rifle at her face and pulled the trigger. His youngest sister was killed instantly. Butch aimed his rifle at Dawn's head, literally blowing off the left side of her face. It was just after 3 a.m. that in a span of less than 15 minutes, Ronald Butch DeFeo Jr. had brutally slain every member of his family in cold blood. Butch calmly showered, trimmed his beard, and dressed in jeans and work boots. He then collected his bloody clothing and the rifle, wrapped them up in a pillowcase, and headed out to his car. In the minutes before sunrise, Butch drove into Brooklyn and disposed of the pillowcase and its contents by tossing them into a storm drain. The tragedy in Amityville made grim local news, but few outside of New York ever heard about the house until some time later. The horrendous events that followed began on December 18th, 1975, when a young couple named George and Kathy Lutz bought the house on Ocean Avenue for $80,000. Just a week before Christmas, they moved into their new dream home with Kathy's 3 children. They would later claim that the dream house soon became a nightmare. Almost from the moment they moved into the house, the Lutz family would insist they noticed an unearthly presence in the house. They began to hear mysterious noises that they could not account for. Locked windows and doors would inexplicably open and close as if by invisible hands. George Lutz, a sturdy former Marine, claimed to be plagued by the sound of a phantom brass band that would march back and forth throughout the house. When a Catholic priest entered the house after agreeing to exorcise it, an eerie, disembodied voice told him to get out. After the aborted exorcism, the events began to intensify. The thumping and scratching sounds grew worse. A devilish creature was seen outside the windows at night. George Lutz was seemingly possessed by an evil spirit, and green slime even oozed from the walls and ceiling. The family was further terrified by ghostly apparitions of hooded figures, clouds of files that appeared from nowhere, clouds of flies that appeared from nowhere, cold chills, personality changes, sickly odours, objects moving about on their own, the repeated disconnection of the telephone service, and the communication between the youngest Lutz child and the devilish pig that she named Jody. Kathy Lutz reported that she often beat and scratched by unseen hands, that one night she was literally levitated above Mistress Black, a local woman, spoke up. Last Easter, I saw Lady Alice sweeping the road outside her son, William Outlaw's house, muttering a spell as she did it. May all the wealth of Kilkenny be swept to my son William, it went. The bishop proceeded to accuse both Lady Alice and her son William and her servant girl Petronella. I saw her gathering herbs to put in Lady Alice's cauldron, Mistress Black added about Petronella. And so William Outlaw, Lady Alice and Petronella were brought before the bishop and their accusers. Lady Alice shook her head in disbelief. William Outlaw shrugged, while Petronella just wept. The bishop stated, I find you guilty, and I sentence you to be taken to the city square, where you'll be tied to a stake, and a fire lit under you, until your godless bodies are burnt to ashes. Lady Alice and William frowned. Petronella fainted dead away. The next day, as the crowds gathered in the square, there was sensational news. Lady Alice had escaped from prison with her son William. Bribed the guards, I bet, the gossip said. William Outlaw offered to pay for the finest lead roof to be placed on our cathedral. As the crowd started disapparating in disappointment, someone yelled, There's still the servant girl, Petronella, and pointed down the high street where Petronella was being dragged from the castle, where a silent crowd watched. She was tied with thick rope to the wooden pole erected in the cobbles. A black-hooded executioner stood behind her, and out of mercy, wrapped a cord around her neck and strangled her. One last moan escaped her lips before her body hung lifeless on the rope. He lit a fire underneath her. Somebody sobbed in the back in the crowd, but nobody left until there was nothing but a pile of black ashes on the ground. The wind whipped them into the air, leaving a stain on the cobbled street that stayed there for many years. The story doesn't end there, however. William Outlaw, good to his word, paid for the new cathedral roof to be placed over the cathedral in Kilkenny. The gossips with the bishop entered the cathedral, admiring the new roof. "'Tis watertight," said Mistress Black, "and heavy. It's even making those rafters sag," the other woman said, as the massive rafters above them moaned with the weight of the lead roof. They continued to sag and crack until one beam snapped clean in two, showing the pale wood of its heart. With more weight for the others to bear, the rafters continued to snap, one by one. The gossips stood, rooted to the spot, unable to tear their eyes away from the scene. With a crack like a hellish whip, the massive sheets of lead, the price of William Outlaw's life, began to tumble into the church building. The gossips ran towards the church altar, but when the roof fell, it pulled the tower down too. It was over a week before they cleared the rubble and pulled out the mangled corpses. It could have been bad luck. It couldn't have been an old witch's revenge. Surely. Lastly, we finish with Bloody Mary. She lived deep in the forest, in a tiny cottage, and sold herbal remedies for a living. Folks living in the town nearby called her Bloody Mary and said she was a witch. No one dared cross the old ground for fear that the cows would go dry, their food stores rot away before winter, their children take off fever, or any number of terrible things that an angry witch could do to her neighbours. cries of the miller and his wife woke the neighbours. They came to assist the frantic couple. Suddenly, a sharp-eyed farmer gave a shout and pointed towards a strange light at the end of the woods. A few townsmen followed him out into the field and saw Bloody Mary standing beside a large oak tree, holding a magic wand that was pointed towards the miller's house. She was glowing with an unearthly light as she set her evil spell upon the miller's daughter. The townsmen grabbed their guns and their pitchforks and ran towards the witch. When she heard the commotion, Bloody Mary broke off her spell and fled back into the woods. The far-sighted farmer had loaded his gun with silver bullets in case the witch ever came after his daughter. Now he took aim and shot at her. The bullet hit Bloody Mary in the hip, and she fell to the ground. The angry townsmen leapt upon her and carried her back into the field, where they built a huge bonfire and burned her at the stake. As she burned, Bloody Mary screamed a curse at the villagers. If anyone mentioned her name aloud before a mirror, she would send her spirit to revenge herself upon them for her terrible death. When she was dead, the villagers went to the house in the wood and found the unmarked graves of the little girls the evil witch had murdered. She had used their blood to make her young again. From that day, anybody foolish enough to chant Bloody Mary's name 3 times before a darkened mirror will summon the vengeful spirit of the witch. It is said that she will tear their bodies to pieces and rip their souls from their mutilated bodies. The souls of these unfortunate ones will burn in torment, as Bloody Mary once was burned, and then they will be trapped forever in the mirror. Thank you for listening. Pleasant dreams.